In this video, we're going to talk about how the jury in the Jonathan Majors trial may have ended up concluding that Jonathan Majors caused his ex-girlfriend's injuries. To do this, I'm going to go through a couple conversations that I had with a real physician, Jess the MD, who explained some very surprising things to me about the injuries involved in this case. The finger fracture evidence was one thing, but the ear laceration was even more surprising to me. Just a note, if you were hoping to see Jonathan Majors get acquitted at trial, this video might be upsetting for you. Not because there's anything particularly offensive in it, but because it shows, in my opinion anyway, how his legal team really let him down. If you've been paying attention to legal news in recent weeks, you probably know that the actor Jonathan Majors was recently convicted of harassment and reckless physical assault in a trial in New York. The trial was pretty contentious, and there were understandably a lot of emotions at play in the discourse that surrounded the trial. Everything from accusations of media bias to racism to DV apologism, there is a lot here in this trial that was invoked for a lot of people that I think in some ways impacted the way that many saw this trial and saw the outcome of this trial specifically. One of the things that does make analyzing this case hard is the fact that, as I've talked about many times before, there were no cameras in the courtroom. This meant that everyone who was following this case, who wasn't actually physically inside the courtroom, had to rely on those who were inside the courtroom to give accurate and complete information as to what was going on. And I will throw a bone to the reporters in the courtroom and say that to a certain extent, they were really hamstrung in what they could produce to the outside world because, for example, none of the photos of injuries could be handed over to the press to be published until the trial was almost completed. One of the secondary impacts of all of this is the fact that the public perception was affected by what kinds of information people could actually analyze on their own to determine what they thought about this trial. And the reasons why people found this trial so important can definitely vary from person to person. For some, it was about race relations with the police and with the judicial system as a whole. For others, it was about how men are treated by the system when a DV accusation is made against them. And then for others, it was about how victims or alleged victims of DV are treated by the system when they come forward with an accusation. People are drawn to the cases that we cover on this channel for all kinds of reasons, but at the end of the day, they come away with some kind of impression as to how our judicial system is working. Is it working properly? Is it working fairly? And so when a jury comes to a particular conclusion that people either don't expect or maybe even don't want, it's important to dig in, look under the hood, and try to figure out how the jury may have come to the conclusion that they did. I know there are a lot of people who are upset about the fact that Majors was convicted of reckless physical assault. And a lot of people are satisfied with concluding that this was a racial issue or a gender issue. And that may have played some kind of a role here. But the thing to keep in mind is that the judicial system is not going anywhere. And at some point, someone will have a case that is in some way similar to this one. And so it's really important for that next case that comes up to understand as much as possible what happened here, so that the next time something like this comes up, there's a lesson learned that can lead to potentially a different result. Now, I did come out with a video talking about the legal elements of reckless physical assault that the jury needed to analyze to come to this conclusion and how Majors was found guilty in light of that. And I talked about the strategy that the defense used and how I disagreed with that strategy, knowing what I knew about those elements of reckless physical assault. But one absolutely crucial element that the jury needed to decide in order to find Majors guilty of any kind of physical assault is that he caused Jabbari's injuries. Now, throughout the trial, I admit that I was pretty skeptical of the jury being able to find that he caused her injuries. And this was based on the information that was publicly available, specifically the video surveillance footage of Jabbari out on the street with a group of strangers that she met and then in the nightclub. But I've always said that my area of experience, education, and knowledge is law. It's not medicine. So in cases like this, I like to talk to real experts to get their professional opinions. And this is why I spoke with Jess the MD. She's a primary care physician who sees all kinds of ailments, to include injuries like the ones alleged in this case. And she covers this kind of content on her YouTube channel. So if you're interested in learning more about this kind of stuff, check her out. She's linked in the description below. So during the trial, she and I analyzed the surveillance footage that was available. And she told me all about finger fractures and pain tolerance and all kinds of things that were really helpful to understand the likelihood that Jabbari may have been injured by Majors. And then when the photos of Jabbari's injuries were finally published to the world, I really wanted to get her professional opinion on those as well to see if maybe there was some kind of a change or if what her previous thoughts were confirmed. So we had two different conversations, one where all we had was that surveillance footage and one where we had photos of Jabbari's injuries and some additional surveillance footage from the car when they immediately got out of the car and then ultimately ran through the streets of New York. And I will say it was fascinating to see how the photos of those injuries changed the analysis in a really surprising way. And ultimately, I walked away from these two conversations feeling even more like the defense used absolutely the wrong strategy here. Keep watching to the end to understand exactly what I mean. Now, as I mentioned before, our analysis in this whole case was made more difficult because of the fact that so much information was kept behind a wall. And I understand why both Majors and Jabbari would want to retain as much privacy as possible. Privacy is a huge deal, and once your information is out there, it can make you vulnerable in so many ways. Privacy leaks can lead to annoying spam calls, weird targeted advertising, insurance scams, and more. And that's why I really love the sponsor of today's video, Incogni. Sorry, you guys know how much I love a smooth transition. Incogni is a data privacy protection company that scans the internet for information to get it removed from the deep, dark data brokers on the internet buying and selling your information. And if you go to incogni.com/legalbytes, you'll get a whopping 60% off. With Incogni, you don't have to do the hard work of scanning the entire internet for your private information. All you have to do is sign up and they do everything for you. They start by scanning the internet for your information. This includes stuff like your full name, your email, your home address, your relatives, your employment history, even your social security number. Then they immediately get to work to request that these brokers remove your data from their databases. Some of these get resolved in literally minutes. I had something like 20 databases remove it immediately. And I have to say that immediate response was really satisfying to see. Anyway, then they start to deal with some of the trickier data brokers, the ones who like to give a hard time before removing your information. Incogni handles the back and forth and grinds them down until your information is cleared. And at this point, I've now had my personal information successfully removed from 88 data brokers. The fact that there were so many to begin with is obviously terrifying, but it's amazing to see the progress that has been made just by signing up with Incogni. Now, technically, I could, of course, do all of this myself, but that would involve finding all the data brokers, then looking up the right language to use in my request to remove all of the stuff, drafting everything myself, and then arguing back and forth with these jokers to remove my stuff from the internet. And honestly, all of that is a huge headache that I don't have the time or the patience to deal with. Considering how much time all of that would take me, it is so worth the cost of Incogni services. I mean, look here, Incogni calculates that this would have taken me 67.5 hours to get this far. And honestly, I feel like this is actually a conservative estimate. So if you want the internet cleared of your personal private information, go to incogni.com/legalbytes and enter the code legalbytes for your 60% off an annual Incogni plan. The link is in the description below, and be sure to use the code legalbytes for your 60% off. And thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. So like I said before, Dr. Jess and I had two conversations. The first was when we looked at surveillance footage from when Jabbari met the strangers and went out to a nightclub. Because there really was such limited information on the ear laceration injury, most of the focus of this first conversation was on the finger fracture. To begin, Dr. Jess explained the basics of finger fractures, the different types, and how these different types can be caused by different types of impact to the bone.
So there are multiple different types of fractures, right? There are different locations. There are different mechanisms of injury that actually cause different types of fractures. Things like spiral fractures versus crush injuries. And each different mechanism will show up differently on x-rays, right? You'll see if it's a distal fracture, right? The end part of the finger, usually that's a crush injury. You'll also usually see some soft tissue injury that's very specific to it, like tendon ruptures. When we're talking about more proximal, so closer in towards the body, there's different phalanges, right? The first, second, or third.
Okay.
So the most proximal, usually you would see something like a spiral fracture. You don't often see crush injuries unless it's a major, like something big and heavy has fallen on this hand and the bone
Okay.
is crushed. The bone here, I mean, you can just feel it, right? It's thicker towards the bottom of the finger than towards the end. It's a lot easier physiologically to crush this part.
Mhm.
So really, I think, like I said before, having that small bit of information of where the fracture was and what type of fracture gives us a lot of information.
Okay. Okay. So I guess with the allegations that have been made about this fracture,
Mhm.
saying that it was caused when he tried to grab the phone from her.
Yeah.
What would you expect that fracture to look like? Both like what type of fracture and like where on the finger would you expect to see that?
So I could see it a couple of ways. It could be a crush injury, right? If she's, I'll just use my phone as an example. Excuse me. She's holding her phone and he kind of grabs it really hard and crushes her finger
Okay.
against the edge of the phone. So right, so we
Okay.
can see a crush injury in that way.
Okay.
If he's grabbing her phone or grabbing his phone rather and twisting her finger, you're
Mhm.
expecting more of a proximal injury with more of a spiral fracture potentially. You can see the fracture going into the joint. There's, again, lots of different types, but yeah, I would, depending on how and when the fracture happened during that incident, you could see different outcomes.
Okay. Okay. So we actually kind of regardless of like which side someone is looking, like which
Hmm.
perspective someone is taking, defense or prosecution, you could
Yeah.
see multiple types of fractures then.
Definitely, definitely. And
Okay.
honestly, multiple fractures in the same incident, right? Like both of those things could have been true. Hitting her finger against the phone on the edge could have caused a crush injury. Grabbing it and turning her finger, that axial load, that spiraling kind of load, can
Right.
cause that. So they can all exist together,
Okay.
theoretically.
Okay, okay. So and also in the opening statements, the defense said that their expert would be testifying that the fracture was more consistent with someone either falling or hitting something. So what would you
Mm.
expect that to look like?
Probably more of a crush injury then, honestly. Just if
Okay.
you think about it, if you fall, say you fall and you hit your finger against a wall, it's that end part that hits
Okay.
first and will get the brunt of that force, the brunt of that impact.
Now, in addition to that baseline information, we also needed to go over the topic of what we could expect someone's behavior to look like in the aftermath of a finger fracture. For example, what should we expect of their mobility due to things like pain or swelling? What should it look like in terms of bruising? Here's what Dr. Jess had to say about the pain element and her general thoughts based on what we knew about the case at the time.
I mean, truly, pain is so variable, right? Pain is a very, very subjective thing. It really has a lot to do with A, what kind of injury or what's happened, and B, the emotional state someone is in. And so sometimes, like she had said that Grace Jabbari had said that she was in such a highly emotional state that she just didn't feel it. So I would think maybe adrenaline is going and, she's in fight or flight. However, on the flip side of that, I would expect a lot of times when someone is very emotional, pain can be amplified. And so
Oh,
it can go either way here, right? And
okay.
it's hard to say what the answer is, right? On the question of when does it show up, obviously a fracture, it hurts right away, or you should feel it to some degree right away. If she was intoxicated, that's another reason to not feel it. I actually,
Right.
in one of my videos, had brought up I I fractured my foot at my bachelorette party, and I wasn't completely intoxicated, but I was tipsy. I was not sober. The minute it happened, it was like a switch, and I was like, okay, I'm sober now. This really hurts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a very sobering event. Now, a foot arguably might be a little bit more painful than a finger, but still, again, pain is so subjective that it's hard to say
Yeah.
exactly when she might feel it.
Yeah.
Another thought I
Okay.
had that, you know, like, of course, it's alleged that the fracture happened during the car fight event. But
Yes.
also, if she wasn't sober and had fallen asleep on the floor with some sort of sleeping medication in her system, we don't know exactly what it was and how strong it
Mhm.
was. Could she have fallen in the bathroom by herself and fractured her finger then? And that's why she's feeling the pain later, because potentially, theoretically, hypothetically, that's when it happened. I don't know. I've had kind of
Yeah.
these thoughts swirling in my head of, how can we prove? Can we actually prove when that fracture happened? And again, it depends on mechanism of injury. So
Yeah.
you had mentioned that it's been released that it looks more of like a, she fell or she hit her finger against something, right?
That's what the
That leads
defense
me
says anyway.
away.
Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I guess
Yeah.
that leads me away from thinking that it's, you know, axial load, like a finger's been twisted and broken in that way.
And here's what she had to say about potential mobility and bruising of the finger. Here's another question for you. I mean, I know that there's obviously we've mentioned that there probably is some variability in this, but what about something like mobility? Can my experience with breaking a pinky was, I mean, it was down here, so like right by the
Yep.
knuckle, but immediately very painful. B, I couldn't bend it at all, and it started to
Mm-hmm.
bruise fairly quickly. So, but
Yeah.
that's my experience. What's the variability on mobility and bruising?
So
Okay.
bruising can be incredibly variable. Different colors show up at different times. You may see just swelling start to happen first and some
Okay.
erythema or redness, and then start to see all the colors come up a little bit later. Again, timeline, you know, if it's like 6, 8, 10, 12 hours later, it's definitely going to be black, purple, big bruise.
Okay.
Initially, you might just see some swelling. Honestly, that's what you'll see first, because when you have a fracture, a bone fracture, blood that was within the bone marrow part of it is now coming out. That you're
Oh,
forming this bruise. So you're
okay.
having an expansion in volume first before you start to see all those colors come up to the surface. Because all those
Okay.
colors are just, it's blood. It's
Yeah.
blood at different stages of decay, when it's, you know, not flowing through your veins, when it's
Yeah.
extricated into the skin.
Okay. Okay.
So I would expect it to have swollen and her not to be able to use that finger very easily almost immediately, especially if
Okay.
it's lower down in the finger. Again, a crush injury more towards the tip of the finger may be less evident because it's a much smaller space, it's a much smaller bone, there's less blood there. So
Okay.
again, it's variable.
So if the fracture, for example, is on like the end of the finger, maybe the whole thing doesn't
Mhm.
swell up, but it just swells a little bit at the end. So you still
Right.
retain some mobility, but maybe not so much at the very end. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
Interesting.
So if the fracture is at the end, you will definitely not immediately have swelling more closer in proximal to the body. And so
Okay.
yes, you may retain mostly complete mobility at that point. Sorry,
It's
one thing I also do want to mention is sometimes people will fracture bones, and not realize it until much later. I have had
interesting.
actually an astounding number of patients that fracture their ankles and walk on them and come into me like a month later saying, "Hey, I twisted my ankle and my ankle still hurts. What is going on?" And we get an x-ray and it is a in the process of healing fracture. So
Wow.
again, pain is so variable that it's
Yeah.
hard to really pinpoint, like, she should be
Yeah.
feeling like this.
Yeah, right. And especially
Mhm.
because I mean there is testimony. She's a dancer. She's a classically trained one.
Mhm.
She's used to probably a lot of pain, having danced ballet her whole life and danced
Yeah.
professionally at that. So I definitely would imagine that she is used to tolerating pain, maybe has even sort of been desensitized to pain to a certain extent, in s-
Yeah.
in factors like that. So um
Yeah.
So, that's something that I definitely would be willing to believe. So, now that we know the baseline of different things we might be able to expect, we turned to the surveillance footage to see if there was anything that we could figure out by observing Jabbari's behavior related to the finger. One point in particular was where Jabbari was putting up her hair with a rubber band hair tie. Dr. Jess said that most likely at this point, fight or flight is less of a factor. And so she would expect Jabbari to feel at least some kind of discomfort in her finger at this point. This made it strange for Jabbari to be putting her hair up this way while not, for example, keeping her middle finger out of the activity of pulling on the band.
The thing that really bothers me, that for the first line, that middle image
Yeah.
where she's fixing her hair,
Yeah.
regardless of where her finger is broken, she should feel something at that point.
Okay.
That's the
So,
one part where when I saw that footage, I was like, holding a phone, that feels like it could reasonably happen with a broken finger and
right.
not be super painful. But really getting in there, I mean, you've tied your hair back, right? Really getting in
Many times.
there, the scrunchie will hit your finger, it will pull it. If something's fractured, it's gonna be painful. And I would at least expect her to be, kind of holding her finger like this while she's, for example, if it's her index, right? Holding a
Yeah.
finger out and not letting
Yeah.
it be part of that whole action.
Yeah, because that's a lot of pressure to put on
Yeah.
something that I would think would feel pretty sensitive at that point, but,
Yeah.
okay, so even 10 minutes after the altercation, you think that that would be the case? Um,
Yeah. Fight or flight doesn't
okay,
last that long. A few minutes after getting out of the car and kind of breathing, I would expect her to then start feeling something. Whether it's
okay.
super painful or just like, oh, something feels a little weird. But even if it feels a little weird, I would not expect her to be doing her hair like that.
And Dr. Jess said something similar about the way that Jabari was manipulating her heavy coat.
The thing that kind of a couple of things stuck out to me, her handling her coat, which seems to not be the lightest of coats, again, would put kind of downward pressure on that finger, whether it's all of them, but if you have pressure from your index finger down onto your middle finger that's fractured, you're gonna feel something. It can't not be anything. The one thing I wanted to mention is our bodies do not want to live in fight or flight all the time. So our bodies
Mm,
do a very good job of trying to calm us down. And so if she's exited from the extremely stressful situation of being in the car with the alleged abuser, she would calm down. Maybe not immediately, but this seems like it's at least several minutes after the incident, right? Like she seems
yeah.
by her behavior not super flustered and relatively calm. That it doesn't make sense to me based on her behavior that she might still be in fight or flight, experiencing that adrenaline rush and therefore not feeling any sort of pain whatsoever, regardless of whether she's a professional dancer that has a good amount of experience with pain. Does that make sense?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. No, absolutely. Now, when we looked further at the surveillance footage from the nightclub, we looked at a few more moments to see if there was anything that we could tell, either using the finger or hand in a way that was maybe inconsistent with having this kind of injury, or maybe in a way that looked like she was having to work around that injury. Here's an example where she's holding her hands over her purse and then paying at the bar and taking her champagne glass in her right hand. It could just be resting on like on top of her hand,
Right.
which
Yeah.
could be like a protective kind of like placement, but or
Mechanism.
just
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah.
or it could be
Yeah.
like her. I mean, I'm trying to like look at this openly from both sides of
Yeah.
what seems more
Yeah.
likely. So then she grabs her.
Right.
Okay, so hang on. Yeah, so
Did
she
she grab
reaches into
it
her
with her
purse.
right?
Yeah.
Which again, I would expect some
Let me check
level of
again.
gingerness at this point. And
Okay.
it seems like she did grab where her middle finger had a lot of that weight of that drink. Just
Okay. Let's
again,
look
the
back at it
shape of a
again.
champagne glass, right? Yeah, if you look
Yeah.
at it, she grabs it where she's holding a lot more of it with her middle finger.
Okay. So rather than
You see that?
like holding it more with this
You
finger
know,
and this finger, for
something,
example.
yeah. Or like that, like something to indicate that there's any level of pain at all in this finger.
Okay.
And again, it could be because she is intoxicated that she's not really feeling it. Um, but broken bones, like I said, they often are very sobering.
And then here's a close up of Jabbari pushing what looks like her wallet back into her purse.
That is questionable, rummaging in her
Okay.
purse like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could have been a little bit more force on the index finger when she grabbed that drink, looking at it up close.
Okay.
That one's hard to say. I can't say it would swing me in either direction.
And finally, here's where we looked at the surveillance footage of Jabbari dancing at the nightclub. What was most notable and questionable, honestly, was the fact that she was being twirled around using her right hand for contact with the other person. I mean, I can just say when I've broken my pinky finger, if anybody held my right hand,
Yeah,
I
you feel it
I know I would,
throughout.
yeah, I would not be
Mhm.
dancing freely like that.
Yeah,
Um, but that's my
pain
experience.
radiation is a thing, right? Like nerves, we have them throughout our whole body. And when you have pain in one spot, it doesn't stay localized to that spot. So depending on how bad the fracture is, I would expect that pain to be radiating further out. If it's, for example, at the base of her finger, I would expect it to be even the pain to be in her hand, up maybe
Oh.
through some of the neighboring fingers. It doesn't just stay localized. As you said, right? You don't want anyone holding your entire hand when it's just one finger.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
and the
and that's
twisting
interesting.
really bothers me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And that actually the fact that it's the middle finger that's fractured, then that radiation
Mhm.
of pain seems like that would impact the entire hand. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
To
it's
some
like,
degree. Yeah.
okay. I mean, assuming that she's
Yeah.
feeling pain, obviously. That's
Mhm. Right.
definitely an asterisk.
That's an assumption. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But again, for the average person, I would expect them to feel something, whether it's extreme pain or a little bit of something is wrong.
Okay. Okay.
With the asterisk that if she's been drinking, it may kind of dampen that.
So, all of this considered, Dr. Jess seemed somewhat skeptical of Jabbari's take on these various injuries, given what we saw from the surveillance footage, while still considering that we need more information in order to definitively say either way. When I asked her for her overall interpretation of the potential injury, here's what she had to say.
I'm mixed because there clearly is a fracture, right? It's documented, but it doesn't appear obvious in any of her behaviors during this, her going out after this altercation. I The one part where I'm like, well, maybe she was nursing it a little bit was when she kind of held her hand. But other than that, I don't see any indication of her protecting or kind of trying to help that finger that's injured. Alcohol can only do so much. And yes, she wasn't entirely sober, but I would still expect her to feel something. And she's doing a lot with that finger that I wouldn't expect to happen with a fracture, regardless of where it is on the hand.
So at the end of this conversation, I didn't really feel like my opinion changed all that much from what I thought going into it. That's not inherently a problem, of course, but it's something worthwhile to point out. But after this conversation, the photos of Jabbari's injuries came out, along with the video surveillance footage from the moment Majors and Jabbari got out of the car, cross the street, and then take off running. So I was really excited to find out more from Dr. Jess based on this new information. And I will say this conversation was both surprising and enlightening. Here's what Dr. Jess had to say now that she had more information. First, although we didn't have an x-ray to be sure, she pinpointed where she thought the fracture might be on Jabbari's right middle finger. What are your thoughts on this image?
Yeah. So looking at it, we had previously kind of discussed, well, if it's this kind of injury, then we think one thing versus another. So we talked about, is this kind of at the fingertip? Is this a distal phalanx injury? And are we thinking this is like a crush injury versus a spiral fracture? And I know you mentioned in your recent recap that the medical expert said that it did not look like a spiral fracture based on the x-ray. Unfortunately, we don't have access to the x-ray, so I can't see it myself.
I know.
But I really wish. I looked at it and I tried to search for it because I really wanted to see it, but it's not available. So looking at that, that's probably a proximal fracture. And looking at the kind of placement of the bruising, honestly, you can't tell from this picture whether it's a spiral fracture or what type of fracture it is.
Interesting.
But you can pretty much definitively say that it's in that middle piece of the finger, right? The middle phalange.
Right.
So that's kind of all we can gather from just looking at that picture. Now, mechanism, she still definitely could have jammed it somehow. Was it him grabbing the phone if it wasn't a spiral fracture and he didn't wrench her finger? Like, you would expect a spiral fracture to happen when you wrench that finger, kind of turn it forcefully. If it's not a spiral fracture, then what was the mechanism? I would think it's more of a direct blow or kind of jamming her finger, hitting it on something. That actually, now that I say that out loud, makes a lot more sense because you're having bruising on both of those joints. So you would expect that force, kind of forward force, where it's hit from the front, you would expect there to be some sort of injury kind of trickling backwards. So that's, when I look at that, that's how I'm kind of evaluating it and what I'm seeing. I don't think it's a crush injury up at the fingertip.
Okay.
I would expect more swelling and more bruising really at the top, but gravity does move the bruise, that blood down through the finger, right? So if she's been like holding her hand up like this, you would expect that bruising to come downwards too.
Interesting.
So we can come up with multiple stories.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So one of the things that I noticed is obviously there's two bruises there. There's one on this joint right here, and then one on this joint right here.
Yeah.
Does that seem to, like, I look at that as a non-expert at all. I look at that and I think maybe there's multiple fractures. Could that be, or what, or no?
I doubt it, honestly. So when I see that, I'm thinking there's probably that fracture in the middle, and obviously blood spills out from there and it goes to the closest spots that have open space. So it would be those two joints that would kind of collect the extra blood that spilled out. That's why I'm kind of looking at it thinking the joint, or excuse me, the bone that probably broke was right in the middle there. And that's why that bruising surrounds it.
So that would be, I'm using the cursor here. It would be this joint right here would be where the fracture is. Interesting.
No, I'm thinking.
Down here?
I don't think you can see it. Yeah, I don't think the joint is where the fracture is. The bone
really? Okay, hang on. Let me zoom in. Do you think in between the two?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, because if usually you're not going to see, the joint is more of an open space. It's a space that moves, that has cartilage in there. It doesn't have bone to fracture, except for the two bones that connect it. If you want to pull up just like an anatomy x-ray, not x-ray, but like an anatomy photo, I can show you a little bit better.
All right, so when we're looking at the anatomy, we're just looking here at the bones of the hand. Imagine you're looking at her third finger right here. The bruising that we're seeing is right in here and right in here, okay? So when I'm talking about a distal fracture, I'm talking about this part of the bone, or this bone rather, being fractured. When I'm talking about a more proximal fracture, it's either this one or this one. In this case, my suspicion is that the fracture is here in this bone somehow, well, it sounds like it was not a spiral fracture, but it could still be it could be on an angle, but usually those spiral fractures are the ones that show up on an angle on the x-ray. But where does the blood go? There's not really much space here for it to pool because you've got all this tissue, all this skin and everything compressed right up against the bone. You can even see it. There's some open space here in the joint here or here. and that's where you expect the blood to pool because
Okay.
just by physics, it fills an open space.
Right.
That's, I think, why we're seeing bruising in those 2 spots, and that's why I think that the fracture is in this bone.
Okay. That
We
makes
could
then it found
Yeah.
the 2 closest places for the blood to go then. Okay, that makes sense
Exactly,
then.
exactly. The other thought, though, is if she potentially had a fracture here, right? If she did have a crush injury to this distal phalanx, you could see with gravity, you could see bruising come down, and again, filling the spots that are most open, and so the bruising would be most intense there. Because we do still see some bruising around the finger here, it's just less significant, less intense. So those are kind of my 2 thoughts, but
Okay.
if it's not a spiral fracture, he probably didn't grab her hand and or her finger and wrench it around. It's
Okay.
probably more of a direct blow or a crush that happened. And
Okay.
again, we're just we're just guessing here because we don't have
Right.
still all the information.
Yeah, the actual X-rays.
Yeah.
Um, so so okay, so then the bruising doesn't necessarily show where the impact happened on her hand necessarily.
Not
Um,
necessarily.
so and that's interesting to me because my brain sees 2 bruises and thinks that's where the impact probably was because that's like blood flows to the part that's been injured. That's what
Yeah.
what my brain wants to think. So that's really fascinating then.
The
Um,
hand smaller joints are very unique, and so yes, I totally like, if you get hit on the arm, like, say you get hit here, you're
yeah.
gonna see a bruise there, right? But that's because there is a little bit more open space. There's more room for blood to pool in one spot there. The
That
hand,
makes
it's
sense.
such a small space. It's so delicate. Honestly, the hands are so delicate that, yeah, that's why you see bruising kind of move around and shift there.
Interesting. Interesting. That's okay, that's honestly fascinating. So do you have any other thoughts on the fracture, the finger fracture?
Not really. It's very clear that it wasn't wrenched around if it wasn't a spiral fracture. So that kind of that sets that aside, and now
Okay.
we kind of have a better idea of mechanism. But
Okay.
again, could it have been she hit her finger really hard on the door as she was trying to open the door, that it had nothing to do with what he did? Yeah, it really could have. So although we've established a timing of the injury, we still really haven't officially established a mechanism, which
Right.
bothers me and introduces doubt.
Yes. Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
So and that's so you mentioned the timing. So one of the things
Mhm.
that did come out in the last couple days of trial was Chloe Zoller's testimony where she said that when they were walking into the nightclub, Grace Jabbari complained about her finger hurting and so she gave her ice from the champagne bucket. So that I think given the fact that Chloe is an objective third person, she hasn't had a relationship with Jabari. She didn't know her before that night. I think that is probably pretty reliable testimony from someone who has a low likelihood of bias, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um, Probably establishing a decent timing of that injury. Um, so I mean, sure, maybe it could be after the chase happened, she fell and hit herself and, before she got to the club, but
Yeah.
she's been with this group of people, no one testified to that. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's the part that is damaging to Majors in my opinion in this case. Is the idea that injury could have happened throughout at some point during this whole exchange, whether that's inside the
Right.
car as he's putting her back in the car or shortly thereafter. I don't know. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
If my
Okay,
other
but
question is, was her finger accidentally slammed in the car door at some point? Like, there wasn't actually any mention of anything to that extent, and so
yeah.
I'm like, I don't know, but again, could it have been herself? Like, I still don't have for sure evidence, right, that it was him that caused the injury. So I don't yeah, I just
Yeah.
have doubt.
There's timing of the injury, which is important, but
Mhm.
there's no clear evidence on mechanism of the injury, and therefore
Exactly.
how can you know who like how she got it if you don't know like how like who caused it if you don't know
Right.
even how she got it in the first place. That makes
Exactly.
sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, as you can see, there still are plenty of questions here based on the information that was not available to us still at this point. But what's important here is that the Chloe Zoller testimony established timing wise a latest possible moment of causation of that fractured finger. In other words, Chloe Zoller's testimony established that the finger fracture couldn't have happened after Jabbari arrived at the nightclub because the moment they walked inside, Jabbari complained to Zoller about her finger, and Zoller offered her ice from the champagne bucket to soothe her pain. This is important because it increases the likelihood that the injury happened at or in the car. And that in turn increases the possibility that Majors is the one who caused that injury. This is why it's kind of wild to me, honestly, that the defense team, when arguing about the finger fracture and honestly the ear laceration as well, just argued she's a liar, don't bother believing her. When in fact, there is objective evidence that tends to corroborate at least part of Jabbari's claim. When that kind of evidence exists, it's a far better strategy to say, hey, this injury may have happened at this time, even at this place. It does not mean that this guy is the cause. Did Jabbari do this to herself in trying to vigorously get the phone from Majors? Has the prosecution established that Majors actually did anything to cause that finger fracture? That kind of an argument at least produces the possibility that there's still questions in the minds of the jurors while they are analyzing this. But on the other hand, a blanket denial, such as the one used by Major's defense team here, doesn't really work when the other side starts to look more like a reasonable alternative given the evidence presented. Now, that's the finger fracture. I have to admit, the ear laceration evidence that became available was much more damaging to Major's case with the strategy that the defense team used. Let's go back to my second conversation with Dr. Jess to understand why. Here's what she had to say about the ear laceration. So this image looks like it's her left ear, but it's actually, oh my goodness, hello.
Oh, kitty. Hi.
This is Maverick.
Hi, Maverick. Oh my gosh, I love it.
Okay, so anyway, back to the ear laceration. So
Yeah.
the image makes it look like it's the left ear, but it's the right ear. I don't know if it's because
Okay.
it was taken as a selfie or
Mm,
what.
okay.
But just pretend that this is her right ear and not her left ear.
Okay. Okay. So, I know that the medical expert rather had mentioned that a direct blow would not cause this, and I agree. If she had just been hit straight on, that would not cause a laceration like this. What might is a blow kind of from the back and like hitting the ear towards the front.
Okay.
So again, direct sideways blow, absolutely not. That's not going to cause this. But it could have, there's some shearing involved, right? It had to have been pulled for a wound to open up in that direction.
Okay. So a lot of people have pointed to the hello cat. A lot of people have pointed to the video surveillance footage from when he's putting her in the car and said maybe that's when it happened. Is that possible based on we can pull that up again just to look at it for that specifically. But based on what you've seen, what do you think is it? I mean, and again, it's also very grainy. It's not a very clear image.
One way I could see it happening, and I'll kind of talk about what makes me think that wouldn't have been the case. But one way that I could see it happening is if she's facing him and he's pushing her into the car and her ear kind of gets sheared up against the seat. And that's when that injury happens. But you would expect to see blood then in the car to some degree, even if just a drop. You would expect to see something there, especially if there was enough blood to kind of, make her hair get all matted up against it.
Right. So to me, like this looks like a slice. You're talking about a shear where it could have been could it have been just by pulling the ear forward enough?
Real hard. Yeah. Yeah. This
Okay.
is I I highly doubt there was any like sharp object that like sliced it. Especially because you're seeing like, look at how red the earlobe is. Like that back, there probably was some friction that happened there to have that be that red.
Okay. Interesting. So
Again, just
then
my guess.
yeah, okay, okay. I mean, and this is all, all any of us are doing is
Yeah,
just looking at what's in front of us and trying to piece things together.
yeah.
So then it seems like that laceration could have been caused not necessarily by coming in contact with anything in particular on
Mhm.
that spot, right?
Right. Oh,
So
yeah. Yeah,
so
it's could be her ear itself was pulled, and that's I mean, that's right in that kind of that dent between where the earlobe meets the rest of her head.
right.
Um, so
Interesting.
it looks like it really was sheared, like it was pulled with a lot of force, whether that's because there was friction enough to kind of have her ear stick to whatever it was, and then she was still moving backwards. Um, and it absolutely could have been something it probably was something that he did to cause that to happen, but I don't think it was a direct blow.
So then what the defense expert said about it probably not being a direct blow could have
Mhm.
been very well accurate, but that still doesn't necessarily rebut the prosecution's case that he could have done this,
Right,
is
right.
what you're saying. Interesting.
Exactly, which makes sense then, and I am not the legal expert here, so
Yeah.
there were several different, or there were 2 rather, 2 charges, assault charges. One was
Mhm,
reckless and one was not, right?
mhm.
So
Yeah.
the reckless one, he was found not guilty, right?
He was found guilty of the reckless one. The
Okay,
intentional one was not
okay,
guilty. Yeah.
okay. So, yes, that is what I'm trying to say here, is that then he absolutely could have caused this injury, but unintentionally.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
still by acting reckless, by pushing her, but, by trying it could have happened when she got in the car for sure, or when he was pushing her into the car.
One thing that this makes me think is so she was sitting on the left side, he was sitting on the
Mhm.
right. It could be that she was trying to lean back away from him.
Mhm.
And if she's looking, I mean, she said that she mostly had her back to him. That's an issue, I think,
Mhm.
for the prosecution. But if she was in a moment facing him and she tries to get back, either he pushes her or she's just trying to like lean away from him. I'm wondering
Yeah,
if like there's enough friction on like leather seats, for example, for that to happen.
100%. In fact, I would expect it more on a leather seat than a cloth seat because leather gets sticky, right? Especially when
Mhm,
there's like with skin. So her
mhm.
earlobe, if it was pressed up to the seat enough, could then have been not stuck, but like there enough friction force to kind of cause again that shearing, especially if one of her earrings got caught on the seat as well.
That is fascinating to me. I never would have considered it looking like potentially like something like this,
Mhm.
based on how I first saw the pictures, and then before that, just the general descriptions of like the laceration behind the ear.
And I think in any case, even if she had, for example, fallen and, had kind of had her head hit the floor, and then have again that kind of shearing force, it would have had to be a lot more kind of forward movement to have shearing to that extent. So I then would have expected, oh, someone pushed her as opposed to she just fell. If we're trying to say,
Mm,
oh, could this have happened like could she have been drunk and fallen and it happened kind of on her own?
yeah.
Maybe, but I think probably less likely.
So, to sum that up, Dr. Jess said that this most likely was a shearing injury. And she said that, in her opinion, this injury most likely would have happened inside the car, given all of the evidence and all of the testimony that came out at trial. So, again, like the finger fracture, we're led to the likely conclusion that this injury happened in or at the SUV. And here's where we talk a little bit more specifically about what this means for the defense strategy. Again, their main theme was Grace Jabbari is a lying liar who lies. But the problem with going that hard on a trial theme or a particular specific argument at trial is that if there's any evidence at all that tends to corroborate those claims, and there isn't much evidence that definitively calls the claims into question, you set up yourself for failure because you're making the other side look like it has a more reasonable universal framework. And in this case, I think the jury looked at what the defense was arguing and looked at what the prosecution was arguing and said, it seems like it's more reasonable to say that she fractured her finger and cut her ear in or at the car on the night of March 25th, 2023. And if the defense doesn't have an adequate explanation for how those injuries could have been caused then and there, but weren't caused by majors, that's a problem for the defense. This is because the jury is likely to look at that absence of argument and say, that's because this case does not favor the defense. And ultimately, that's how I think the jury came to the conclusion that Jonathan Majors injured Grace Jabbari during the alleged incident. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Dr. Jess and I both started out pretty skeptical of the idea that Jabbari's injuries resulted from her scuffle with Majors. But the evidence that came out really started to make it look otherwise. But do you agree or disagree? And maybe to put it another way, can you see how the jury may have concluded that Majors harmed Jabbari? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks again to Dr. Jess for joining me for this video. And I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative if it's not so enjoyable a topic for you. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more trial coverage like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next one.